This is Lecture 8c, Psychology 1200. Now we're going to move along to the area of psychology devoted to malfunctions in humans' thought processes and in their behavior. And this general area of psychology is called clinical psychology. And in fact, clinical psychology is what most people think of when they think about the field of psychology. But notice how broad psychology really is, that most people, when they think of psychology, that's the only thing they think psychologists do is treat people with mental disorder. Well, we're really only going to devote just a few lectures to that. Much of the course involves discussion of areas outside of clinical psychology, just giving you an idea that psychology is much more than just the treatment of mental disorder. But that is, of course, a very important aspect of psychology as well. So we're going to talk in this lecture about the concept of abnormal psychology generally, what does insanity mean, what does psychological disorder mean, and how people go about diagnosing psychological disorders, and then we're going to talk about two broad categories of mental disorder, anxiety and mood disorders.
Well, what is abnormal? Well, the word abnormal is a statistical statement referring to the relatively rare patterns of thought or behavior. But this means great thinkers are abnormal, gifted athletes are abnormal, violent criminals are abnormal. So this isn't a definition that we can apply when we talk about mental disorders, because even though these positive traits are abnormal, we're looking at behaviors that are disruptive. Okay, so depression and anxiety, they wouldn't be classified as abnormal because they're relatively frequent. So it can't just be the frequency of one of these traits, because depression is quite common, whereas being a great thinker is quite rare.
So what's insanity then? Lots of people throw around the word insanity. Oh, that person's insane. Their behavior is just crazy. They must be insane. Well, insanity is really primarily a legal concept, and all it refers to is whether a person knows the consequences of their actions. Do they appreciate that the actions that they're engaging in are wrong? And you'll remember the horrible incident on the Greyhound bus a couple of years ago with a man who had schizophrenia attacked a young guy on the Greyhound bus in front of a number of horrified witnesses and ended up severing his head. Well, he wasn't criminally convicted for that murder because he fell into this category of insanity, that the psychiatrist deemed him, the murderer, the killer, unable to appreciate that what actions they were doing were wrong, and so therefore they were not criminally responsible. So often people with psychological disorders don't fully appreciate the consequences of their actions and actually don't know that it's wrong. So in the case of the Greyhound bus incident, the killer was convinced that the boy sitting next to him was possessed by a demon. And because the psychiatrists were convinced that he really did believe this, then that would make his actions not wrong from the perspective in the insanity state that he was in. Okay? So even people afflicted with depression or phobias may not know fully the consequences of their actions and that what they're doing is wrong, and they're powerless to change their behavior. So people with a mental disorder often can't do anything about it, and that would make them not, in some cases, not, it wouldn't be possible to prosecute them criminally because they're not responsible.
Okay, so what is a mental disorder then? Well, one possible definition is it's a violation of the cultural rules of conduct. So basically, you might be disordered if your culture thinks you're disordered. The problem is that cultures are going to vary on whether or not a behavior is considered deviant or not. So imagine speaking with deceased loved ones. In North America, if you tell people that you're talking with a dead relative, that could be a sign of a mental disorder. However, if you were in other cultures, like Chinese, and you said that you were talking to a deceased relative, that would be considered normal. So the same behavior, depending on the culture, would be labeled as either a mental disorder or as normal behavior. So that's the problem with this definition of a mental disorder. It's not cross-cultural.
Right, and a culture can change across time in terms of what behaviors it considers deviant or not, just indicating that it's not the act itself that's deviant, it's how the culture views it. So homosexuality was considered a mental disorder and a crime not too distant history. Now it's not considered that way at all. So the perception of a behavior as deviant by the broader society does change even across time. Here's another possible definition for mental disorder. Well, it's a person would have a mental disorder if they engage in any kind of maladaptive or harmful behavior. Any kind of behavior that either hurts themselves in some way or is harmful to other people. Now, there's a problem with this definition because if you applied it strictly, it would rule out a lot of behaviors that lots of people engage in, but that are ultimately health-threatening to them. So this labels a lot of behaviors as mental disorder that the culture doesn't seem to define as mental disorder, like the act of smoking or selling cigarettes, boxing, being a soldier, selling cigarettes. If cigarettes are so harmful, the act of selling them would be a harmful behavior that hurts other people, and yet you wouldn't consider that. That's just business. That's not a mental disorder.
Well, maybe a definition should be that you need to experience personal suffering. So you have a mental disorder if you are personally suffering from your behavior. Well, the problem with this is that there are some individuals out there who should be considered mentally ill. They have a mental disorder, but they don't experience any suffering based on their disorder. And a psychopath would be one of these individuals. So they have a mental disorder, they're a psychopath, but they don't have any emotional response to their behaviors. So they're not going to feel like they're suffering based on their mental disorder. And also, if it's that you're going through personal suffering, then that means you'd have to apply the label of mental disorder to a number of behaviors that you wouldn't classify. It wouldn't make sense for you to consider a disorder. So if you lose someone you love, you're going to go through a lot of personal suffering. But you shouldn't be considered mentally ill because you're going through that grieving process. Or if you've been diagnosed with a terminal physical disease, that would cause a lot of personal suffering. So you're physically ill. That doesn't mean that you should be labeled as mentally ill because you're trying to deal with the suffering you're going through based on this diagnosis. Or you're coping with the stress of poverty. That involves personal suffering. But again, that's not a mental illness.
So you get the picture by now that mental disorder is a complicated concept. And it's not like any one of these types of definitions will do the trick. You have to think of the mental disorders based on some combination of deviating from the standards of the culture in terms of what appropriate behavior is, engaging in behavior that's maladaptive or harmful to oneself or other people, or having that experience of intense personal suffering to go along with your psychological state. So to adequately capture what we mean by this person has a mental disorder, you often need a complicated mixture of these three influences. So you can think of these three factors as lying along more of a continuum between normal and abnormal, that a person might be, their behavior might be deviant relative to the culture along a continuum, that they may be in personal distress along a continuum, and they might engage in maladaptive and harmful behavior along a continuum as well. And so you could, based on these three criteria, you could get a sense of where along this normal to abnormal continuum you might fall.
Well, the main diagnostic tool for mental disorders is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, or the DSM-4. Now, the main function of the DSM-4 is to ensure consistency in the labels that are assigned to different psychological problems. So imagine, regardless of the psychologist you go to visit, the clinical psychologist, you should get the same diagnosis because everyone is using this DSM-4 in order to diagnose a mental illness. So you get this consistency. And right now there are over 400, almost 400 disorders listed.
For each type of mental disorder, this diagnostic and statistical manual lists the symptoms of the disorder, and if possible lists typical age of onset of the disorder, predisposing factors, what kind of aspects of your personality might predispose you to this type of mental disorder. Is gender a factor that's influential in the disorder? One gender getting it more often than the other. They tell you how the disorder usually progresses, how common is the disorder in the population, gender differences. Oh, as I mentioned, that's one of the predisposing factors possibly as well. And then possible contribution of cultural influences to the disorder. So quite a list of detail goes along with each of the disorders that find their way into the manual.
And the DSM provides ways to evaluate each client according to 5 different axes. And the first one is the primary diagnosis. The second one is personality traits that may be relevant for treatment. And this might include something like negative emotionality.
Or intelligence.
Yeah, so these different factors that are going to influence your treatment of the patient. The relevant medical conditions or any prescription medications, because these may have side effects as well, so you need to be able to take these into account. The presence of social and environmental stressors, and also the assessment of the client's level of social and occupational functioning. It also assesses whether or not the problem is recent or has a long duration.
Well, you know, this has been a useful tool for clinical psychologists and psychiatrists in diagnosing people and having consistency in the kind of mental illness label that a person gets assigned based on the collection of symptoms that they have. Highly influential, very important tool, but there's a number of problems that people have noted in criticizing this approach to discovering people with mental disorder. And one problem is that once you list disorders in a manual like this, there's a tendency for the therapist and the person that's trying to make a diagnosis of what mental disorder a person might have. There's a tendency for them to over-apply these labels and find mental disorder in people that otherwise wouldn't get a diagnosis of mental disorder. So this is called overdiagnosis, that once you give something a label, the clinical psychologist or psychiatrist might apply it more than is appropriate. And some people have suggested that one childhood disorder known as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, is way overdiagnosed. And what this disorder refers to is an impulsive, messy, restless, easily frustrated child who has trouble concentrating, particularly in school. And there's been an explosion in this diagnosis over recent years. And this diagnosis could well be helping a number of extreme cases, children that really have severe trouble focusing and sitting still and performing at all well in school. But a number of other cases, normal behaviors that you might find in any child can, once you perceive it through this lens of the diagnosis of ADHD, can seem like a disorder. And so quite normal behaviors of childhood, being restless and not being able to sit still for long, long periods of time, might be labeled as a mental disorder where it wouldn't have been if this disorder didn't exist in the manual.
Well, and it's the fastest growing disorder in North America. And when they look at the prevalence of ADHD in North America versus Europe, it's 10 times higher in North America, which suggests an overdiagnosis. When 10 times more children are being diagnosed as ADHD than a child in Europe, and also boys make up 80 to 90% of the cases. So there seems to be some evidence of overdiagnosis.
But this is sort of a fear that, particularly because boys get the diagnosis at a much higher rate than young girl children, there's this fear that you might actually be what's called pathologizing boy childhood. Normal behaviors of boys in childhood may actually be pathologized, which is to say that they may be considered a mental illness when it's just a quite natural situation. Restless boys. Oh, who'd ever thought boys would be restless? They sat for 8 hours a day.
Or girls, for that matter.
Or girls. Mm-hmm.
Well, another problem is something called the self-fulfilling prophecy. So this refers to what happens when you assign a person a mental disorder label, and it can encourage them to act in ways that fit the label. So if you tell a child they have impulse control issues, then they might start acting out more because they've already been told that they don't have a good sense of impulse control. So you're telling them they're this way, so they may start behaving in that way. And this also leads to the person who's been diagnosed with a mental disorder, they can actually intensify their psychological problems because now that's what they're using to define who they are. So they begin to act in ways more consistent with it, just intensifying the problem. And then the other problem is that once you've labeled someone as being, let's say, ADHD, even if they overcome the disorder, so they no longer have the problems associated with that disorder, that label can stick in the minds of other people, and others can treat them as though they still have the same disorder. So it's always going to stick, and that is how others are going to begin viewing this individual. It's a label that would be really hard to shake.
Right, you get this label that you're just an unstable person that's vulnerable to mental illness, even if you've overcome it.
Again, the fundamental attribution error, that it's part of their personality now.
Another problem with the use of this manual is that there's a growing number of mental behavior patterns that are getting introduced into the manual over time. There seems to be an increase all the time of the adding of disorders to the manual. And people have wondered that maybe you're starting to actually consider a lot of normal life concerns, things that are just go along with life. Life isn't easy all the time. Life can be difficult, and just normal challenges of life, people are worrying that they might actually be filling up this manual with a lot of quite normal concerns. So you can find disorders of written expression. So that's if you're just not very good at writing. Math disorders if you just can't really work well with numbers. Caffeine-induced sleep disorder. That's when you drink a lot of coffee and have trouble getting to sleep. So these are very common complaints that people have the world over. Problems with coffee and their sleeping, troubles with math, problems writing clearly, and yet now they're in the DSM and now they're a mental disorder. So people are worried about where you should draw the line between something that's a mental disorder and something that's just an inconvenience of life. So these kinds of disorders don't seem to be in the same category as disorders that you would normally associate with mental illness, which are clearly problems for people that have it, like schizophrenia.
Well, the other problem is you're using this really sophisticated diagnostic and statistical manual for mental disorders, so it seems very scientific and objective. So it makes it feel like it's a very scientific process on deciding what is and isn't a mental disorder. But the DSM is a manual that has disorders in it that are there not based on empirical evidence necessarily, but by the opinion of members of the American Psychiatric Association. So it is objective in that the standards and criteria for the disorders are applied consistently across all patients or cases. But the problem is it doesn't say how good the process is for actually deciding on which disorders are included. So caffeine-induced sleep disorder, does that really deserve to be in there? Is that scientific? Has it been objectively tested? So these are some of the problems. So what disorders are included can really be the result of a cultural prejudice rather than scientific research.
And one example of that is the inclusion of PMS symptoms as a mental disorder, which we'll talk about in a few moments. So some examples of mental disorders are throughout the history of psychiatry and psychology, and even more recently, some examples of mental disorders are based in cultural bias or faulty assumptions and not based in evidence. And these disorders are listed in the DSM But as Lana was saying, nobody sorts out which ones are clearly established based on scientific evidence and which were just included in the DSM because more people raised their hand at the American Psychiatric Association meeting in response to that disorder should be included in the manual. So there's been a number of bizarre mental disorders that seem scientific because they have a fancy name and they're included in diagnostic manuals for psychiatry and psychology that are quite clearly cultural prejudices and have nothing to do with mental disorder at all. For example, in the early 1800s, people considered drapetomania a disease, a very severe mental disorder and very inconvenient one. It's the urge that black slaves might have to escape their enslaved condition. Very problematic and maladaptive behavior, wanting to escape slavery, wouldn't you say? Childhood masturbation disorder was considered an important disease in the mid-1900s, and now the act of masturbation is not even considered a deviant behavior anymore. Homosexuality in the mid-1900s was a mental disorder, and that was abandoned about 40 years ago. They abandoned that as a mental disorder. Nymphomania, mid-1900s, women who like to have sex were considered mentally disordered in the mid-1900s. Nowadays, we don't really consider female sexuality a deviant behavior. And then right now, there's this debate over whether there's such a thing as premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is literally considering a woman as mentally ill just
when she has PMS.
When she has PMS.
And they say that it's an extreme form, but the actual criteria for this disorder is the same as the symptoms you'd experience with PMS. And the drug they use to treat it is Prozac. They've relabeled it so that it can be used for this treatment.
But it's an official statement that a good number of women are going to be more or less psychologically impaired one time a month, which one might worry it could be a mechanism for discrimination against women in the workplace.
That would be a reasonable assumption.
And elsewhere.
Okay, so the process of diagnosing disorder. Well, the first thing you do is an initial diagnosis is done based on an interview with the client and also by observing how the client behaves during a session with a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist. Some other tools that they use are projective tests, and these are based on those psychodynamic assumptions that we talked about earlier about that internal conflict that's going on. So the Rorschach test is one of them. And anatomically correct dolls were used as well as a projective test to see whether or not a child was abused. The other tool would be these objective tests.
So just to give you a little bit more information about these projective tests, that involves clients to perform some action, describe an ambiguous picture, draw a person or a house, as Lana was saying, if you're a child and they want to discover if you've been abused, very young children, if they've been abused physically or sexually, they might bring a doll in and just have the child play with the doll and kind of create a scenario where what would be the kind of thing a grown-up man would do with the doll, or sort of the idea would be for the therapist to look for clues in the child's behavior with the doll, clues of abuse they might have experienced.
The problem with these dolls is when they did research on how children who had been abused and children who had not been abused played with the dolls, there was no difference. Both groups were fascinated with the genitals of the dolls.
Right, these are very anatomically correct dolls, but then it's impossible to tell the difference between abused versus not abused kids with this technique. And sadly, a number of people were accused of egregious acts of sexual abuse because their not abused child was just fascinated with the genitals, and it's not a very funny consequence for the whoever the accused was. Okay, and then as you might have gathered from this example, they use the actions, the therapist, to infer certain aspects of personality or unconscious motives or conflicts or previous experiences that the person might have had. So I might show you a big blotch of ink and say, what do you see in this image? And then what you tell me about it, the content of what you describe in terms of your perception of that really nonsense ink blot on the page, I can infer something about your personality. Oh, you're a generally happy person, or oh, there's a lot of hostility in you, or whatever. Based on that Freudian idea, again, that you can, with the kind of things that people associate with something ambiguous, it gives you an idea of what's going on in a person's unconscious. So you can maybe tell a story about what their unconscious is dealing with and the conflicts that underlie their problemed life. Okay, so the problem with these tests, though, is the way people respond. It's not really reliably related to anything except the biased perspective of the clinician. So if the clinician has an idea that this person walking in is depressed, or versus this person walking in, it has a lot of social anxiety, or whatever the clinician expects, that's how they interpret the story that the patient tells them, the client tells them. The clinician's instructions to the person doing this Rorschach ink blot test or draw a picture test, and the personality of the clinician also has a role to play in the kind of story that the client tells. And then the only thing really having to do with the client that influences what they say in response to these projective tests are the moment-to-moment changes in their concerns of the client. How sleepy are they? What are the kinds of things they're consciously worried about? How much stress they're under, if they feel hungry or not. So what you can gather from all this is that projective tests are useless because most of the content of the story is determined by aspects of the clinical psychologist rather than the client.
Okay, well, objective tests are these standardized questionnaires that ask about the client's behavior and their feelings. Now, some objective tests measure for specific emotional problems, and an example of this would be the Beck Depression Inventory. So this gives you a measure of depression. Other measures various aspects of mental disorder and personality. So a popular one is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI. Now, the reliability and validity are okay, but sometimes it can identify healthy people as mentally disordered.
For example, psychologists rate really high on the dimension of psychopathy, which is that tendency to do bad things and not feel guilty about it. I don't know if that's really true. That's what I've heard. Okay, so now let's talk about some specific disorders. You'll find the disorders grouped into different categories. The first category we'll talk about are anxiety disorders. Now, the state of anxiety is just apprehension, fear, right? When you're fearful. And often anxiety occurs for a good reason, right? If you find yourself in the middle of winter and your car breaks down and a little anxiety rises up in you, it's minus 40 outside, then that's completely normal. And in fact, this is just the alarm phase that we've been talking about, that fight or flight response, that boost in physiological arousal that allows us to prepare for some sort of a danger. But anxiety, when it becomes a real problem for a person, when it's not caused by any rational source of danger, right? Anxiety produces one of two urges. One is to fight, and the other is to run away. And it's people that have intense anxiety, and the only option for them is to run away from the threat. And so the people becomes mental disorder when it's preventing them from doing things in life that they need to do to keep a job and to maintain happy relationships. The anxiety sends them running away from everything. They avoid all the situations that they need to have courage to engage in to be happy and effective people.
Well, here are some different types of maladaptive anxiety responses. So one of them is chronic anxiety, and this would be being in a state of constant apprehension for a long period of time. So just imagine you're constantly waiting for the next disaster. Something bad is going to happen. So it's a very uncomfortable state, and this can lead to health problems. Remember, as Jason was mentioning, that when you have to stay in this resistance phase, it leads to the exhaustion phase. Okay.
It also can lead to that burnout I talked about before, where a person just can't function anymore at their job or in life because they're so tired from being so fearful all the time.
Another anxiety response is a panic attack, and this would be a brief but really intense burst of anxiety. So imagine if you had a panic attack anytime you went outside. Okay, you'd be afraid of going outside. You get a panic attack and your heart starts pounding. It's hard to breathe. You're sweaty. It would just be a really uncomfortable state to be in. Now, phobias is an irrational fear of a specific object or situation. So I might have a snake phobia. I know when I see a gardener snake, rationally, it's not going to lunge at me and kill me. But when I see it, that's what I think is going to happen. And I'm absolutely terrified when I see any type of snake. So this would be a phobia. Obsessive compulsive disorder is when you get a really intense anxiety response for not performing some action. So imagine you have, you always have to go and check if you locked a door. Okay, so you've locked the door, you leave, but then you think, oh, did I lock the door? You have to go back and check. So you go back, you check, turn the handle, yeah, you locked it. You start to walk away again, you begin to doubt yourself. Did you check that the door is locked? Are you sure you locked the door? You can't leave because if you don't perform the action going back and turning the handle again, it'll provide this really intense anxiety. So to reduce the anxiety and the tension, you have to keep performing these actions.
Yeah, to people with this disorder, it feels like the world's going to come to an end if they don't do the action that, if it's only that action that will save them. Their survival depends on it. That's what it really feels like. Okay, just to talk about just a bit more about the symptoms of these disorders. The generalized anxiety disorder is a constant uncontrollable worry, and that's just the feeling that something bad is going to happen any moment. A constant feeling of dread. The kind of feeling that you might get if you walked into a haunted house. That's how these people are walking around every day. It feels like something horrible is going to happen. And the anxiety must occur, though, for people with this disorder on a majority of days for the past 6 months. And it can't be caused by any disease, drugs, or coffee. So this is purely psychological, not influenced by any other physical symptoms.
So for a video illustration of a generalized anxiety disorder, see link number 8 in the Unit 8 links folder. Okay, another anxiety disorder is the post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And this is when a person has constant anxiety after they experience a traumatic event, and it lasts for more than 6 months. So if you were the victim of a violent crime, you might experience post-traumatic stress disorder. Or if you're a soldier, when they come back, they sometimes experience PTSD. So unfortunately, quite a few soldiers experience this disorder. So some of the symptoms are reliving the event in your thoughts and your dreams. So you keep reliving this traumatic experience. You begin to get a sense of detachment from others and an inability to feel happy. You have anxiety associated with high physiological arousal, and this can cause insomnia, irritability, and impaired concentration.
A panic disorder is another type of these anxiety disorders, and what this is recurring attacks of intense fear and anxiety that can last anywhere from between a few minutes to a few hours. And I mean, when you say, oh, attacks of intense fear, it's really hard to capture the full intensity because it really is. Imagine yourself in the moment before you're about to die, and there's just no doubt that you're dying. That's the kind of state these people are in whenever they have these panics that occur. And quite often a person can have them occur at night while they're sleeping. And so one byproduct of this kind of disorder is that a person can end up not getting enough sleep and developing insomnia and other psychological problems as a result of that. So the specific symptoms of the disorder: shaking, dizziness, chest pain, heart palpitations, hot and cold flashes, and sweating, all the kind of feelings you might have if you thought you were about to die.
Now, the cause of panic disorder is often the result of people who are experiencing just normal anxiety that occurs in a stressful situation. They misinterpret it as a sign of imminent danger or death. So just that normal stress and anxiety that can occur gets misattributed to I'm about to die because of this.
And again, it's the problem with focusing on the emotion that you're having rather than in the cause of the emotion. Because one thing that we know is that if you think through the problem you're in, it actually reduces the anxiety you feel because you get a more sensible perspective on it. These are people that don't really think about the cause. They're just really focused on that feeling of being afraid, and that just intensify it to extreme heights. Well, phobias are unusually intense fear of a specific object, situation, or activity, as we mentioned. You might have a phobia for going up in an airplane. You might have a phobia for social situations. For snakes, some common examples are snakes, insects, heights, thunder, believe it or not, enclosed spaces. But there are some other people that have phobias for weird things like the color purple. Forget it. The number 13. People just terrified about the number 13. Completely irrationally afraid of these things. So that's the hallmark of a phobia, where the fear that's generated by the object or the situation is way out of proportion to the danger it poses. Well, where would these phobias come from? And there's two probable causes as far as where a person might develop a phobia. Evolution. We all evolved to be sensitive to fear, to generate fear to certain things and not others. We have, as a human species, developed mechanisms for binding fear with some things that really have survival relevance to us, but not so much others. So spiders in our history, we've probably killed a lot of people, poisoning them. So we have no problem associating intense fear with spiders. Snakes were probably caused mayhem for humans since we evolved, so they're quite easy to bind that fear response to. Heights, how many people have probably fallen off something and died? Even now that happens. Probably happened quite a lot in the environment that we evolved in. Not too hard to develop intense fear in association with heights. So because these things are threats, direct threats to our survival, the evolutionary process probably built in the tendency to be highly fearful in response to these things. But in other cases, negative experiences with certain objects or activities might cause an intense fear response through classical conditioning. So at some point in childhood, you might have had some experience with the number 13 or with the color purple that was so horrifying, you might not even remember it. But now, anytime you encounter that thing, you just freak out. You can't stand to be in the same room as it. You run away. You just have this intense urge to run away. So that would be a learned influence. The others might be more genetic influenced cause of phobias.
So agoraphobia is described as the intense fear of being trapped in a crowded public place. Now, normally agoraphobia starts with an unexpected panic attack in a public place. And then the person becomes to fear having another panic attack in a public place. So they start to avoid public places that might trigger a panic attack. And this can lead to people becoming quite reclusive and staying at home and not venturing out in public. So agoraphobia is sometimes referred to as fear of fear because you're afraid of becoming afraid in public.
And we should point out that a lot of people have minor forms of this. I'm not particularly comfortable in the midst of huge crowds of people. That doesn't mean I have a mental disorder. It's the intensity of it. It has to be an extremely intense reaction, way out of proportion to the actual danger a person faces in that situation for it to actually count as a legitimate disorder. Okay, so obsessive compulsive disorder, some more details about that. involves constant, uncontrollable thoughts or images. And these obsessions can be horrible, like you can't get the thought of killing somebody out of your head, a child, horrible obsessions that the people find completely disturbing to themselves. Why do I keep having this thought? Well, that's an obsession. Might have an obsession about catching some terminal disease. Some germs might get you, and you might get some, you might be killed by some disease. So one of the obsessions that's quite common with obsessive compulsive disorder is an obsession surrounding germs and cleanliness. And so combine these obsessions. Imagine you have an obsession that you're going to be killed by germs, any germs you come into contact with. So you want to stay perfectly clean all the time. You'd want to avoid shaking someone's hand. If you did shake someone's hand, you'd have to rush off to the bathroom to wash your hand to make sure the germs are all killed before they can invade your body. So you combine this obsession with the compulsion, repetitive ritualized behavior. The compulsions are the other half of the obsessive compulsive disorder, in which a person has to perform some actions in a certain way, and they'll experience intense anxiety if they're not performed. So there was one obsessive compulsive disordered person that I heard about that had this specific routine for showering. So they had to wash each part of their body a certain number of times. And if they didn't do it in the correct order, if they forgot, and there maybe the series of steps might have been 30 long of how to wash their body, if they missed a step, if they did something out of order, they had to start all over again. So these people would often spend entire days in the shower just because they could never quite get it right.
Well, there was a video of a woman who had OCD, and she was terrified of germs. So she was always washing her hands, washing surfaces, but her daughter couldn't even give her a hug because when she looked at her daughter, all she could see were germs. So the daughter would have to have a complete shower and then she could touch her mom because otherwise it was too much for the mother to handle. So it can really have serious consequences for your life.
Right, it's a horrible disorder. Luckily, it's not terribly common in the population.
So for a video illustration of obsessive compulsive disorder, you should look at link number 9 in the Unit 8 links folder. So now we're going to talk about mood disorders, and these are disturbances in your emotional experience. So this might be extreme and chronic sadness, so that you are depressed at a level you've never been before. Just the depths of sorrow, and it goes on. Or it could be chronic euphoria. You're as happy as can be, but that can lead to problems as well if you're out of touch with reality.
So one of the most common, really, psychological disorders, and certainly the most common mood disorder, is major depression, which is just a chronic sense of despair and hopelessness. Everything's horrible, my life's terrible, it's never going to get better, I'm a loser. Thoughts of death or suicide often accompany this state because it can be quite painful. What's the point? Nothing's ever going to get better. That's how it feels. Even if that's not true, that's really how it feels for a person with major depression. So they can think, what's the point? Death and suicide become good ideas to them, at least in some moments. They can lack energy to perform even the simplest tasks. Even just washing the dishes will be considered an overwhelming task that they wouldn't be able to get up the energy to do. And feelings of worthlessness, like nobody should want to be my friend, it's pointless for me to be on the planet, that kind of thing. This mood, this deeply sad mood that associates with major depression, is supported by a person's pattern of interpreting events. So a person with major depression will tend to perceive good things that happen as really just got lucky, or always looking for the negative side in a positive outcome, while the importance of a negative events are wildly exaggerated. Person might not do well on a test, they have major depression, and they'll think that they're too stupid to even be in university. That's the only thing that they can interpret that kind of event, instead of they didn't actually spend enough time studying, or the blowing it all out of proportion as an indicator of how worthless they are. So the thought process itself supports maintaining this very sad state.
Bipolar disorder is when you alternate between bouts of mania, so would be really high states of exhilaration or euphoria, but they're mixed in with major depression. So you can be just euphoric and then drop down to the depths of sorrow. Okay, so you go between these two extremes. And this disorder is relatively common among overachievers and those who are highly creative. Mark Twain had bipolar disorder.
Abraham Lincoln.
And the cause is probably genetic or biological. Well, genetic, biological.
In part, it's because the people that achieve outstanding things, they often requires an intense amount of energy, an almost mania, an obsession for their cause, whether it's political, whether it's to be the best writer ever, and then they burn themselves out on in that state of mania. When it ultimately burns out, they've got nothing left. They end up in that trough of depression.
So this is a graph where it shows you the bipolar mood disorder on the bottom. And I want you to note that on the y-axis, so this is the vertical axis, it has the mood state. So you have manic at the beginning, those are those bouts of euphoria, normal mood in the middle, and then depressed, that sorrow and sadness on the bottom. And then time is on the x-axis or the horizontal axis. So with unipolar mood disorder, you only have one of these extremes. So you go normal and then you might drop down and be depressed, but then you'll go back up to normal. But you never go into that manic phase. You're always just dipping down into the depression and then back into normal. With bipolar, you can see that you can go up to manic, stay there, and then drop right down to the depression. Go back up to normal and then drop down again to depression. So you're going to both of these extremes.
Well, just to give you an idea of the age of onset of major depression, just to give you an idea of what kind of age groups we're talking about, you find that people in their 20s, people in their teen years and adolescence, and in their 20s are quite highly susceptible to developing major depression. And actually, older age groups, this tendency sort of drops off. So this is not an example of a psychological disorder that doesn't affect most of the people or the age group that most of the people in the class are at. This is, for most of you, you're probably in the 18 to 25 age range. So these people are quite a high risk for developing major depression.
So for a video illustration of bipolar disorder, you should look at link number 10 in the Unit 8 links folder.
Oh, sorry, I misspoke about that. That's the age of onset. That if a person is going to develop, it wasn't major depression. If a person was going to develop bipolar disorder, they would tend to develop it in their teenage years or adolescence or in their 20s. So it's an early onset disorder. Well, what causes major depression? Let's talk about some of the theories that surround major depression because it's such an important problem. So many people suffer from it. Something like a third of the people during their lifetime will experience a major depression episode. And it's bad for the people. They feel horrible. Sometimes they commit suicide. It's bad for their families. Mood's contagious. A person that's depressed around can actually bring down everyone, make them all feel bad. And it's bad for society because people that experience major depression, they don't function very effectively. They're not very productive in their jobs. And they're not the best of citizens. So it's important to get an idea of what causes major depression. Now there's biological factors involved. There's some strong evidence for genetic contribution to the development of major depression. Depression is thought to occur from imbalances in neurotransmitters and hormones that are important for mood and arousal. So there's some poorly designed brain chemistry that's causing a person to not have as much energy and the level of happiness that they should be able to generate. As far as the chemistry in their brain is not capable of generating it like it is for other people. So there might be a deficiency in serotonin or norepinephrine or an overproduction of cortisol has been associated with major depression, which is a hormone that's involved in responding to stress. So the person feels like they're under a lot of stress and pressure, even when they're not particularly. So these changes in actual brain and body chemistry can be a major influence in whether somebody develops depression or not. So here's the concordance rate we can show a lot of these graphs throughout the year just to give you a sense of is there a genetic contribution? What is the size of the genetic contribution? So identical twins are related 100% in terms of their DNA, and there's a high concordance, that is the percentage of identical twins that both have major depression. One has it. What's the likelihood that the other has it? It's over 65%, whereas it's only about 15% for twins that are only related by half. So that's evidence for a pretty strong genetic contribution to major depression.
Well, another important contributor to depression is your life experience. So if you have unsatisfying or stressful circumstance, it can lead to the development of major depression. So if you've just lost your job, you're out of work, you're trying to support your family, that can lead to a lot of stress, and that can lead to major depression. Well, depression is more likely to occur in women than it is in men. And this could be because women have generally less satisfying work and family lives, and they experience more discrimination and physical or sexual abuse than men do. So these different forms of abuse and discrimination can lead to more stressful life circumstances. As well, for mothers, they're even more vulnerable to developing depression. So the greater the number of children a woman has, the higher the likelihood she is to develop major depression. So more children equals a higher risk for depression.
My guess is that's because they're not getting enough help in raising these kids. That would be my assumption.
Well, yes, life experiences. It's a stressful circumstance if you have 5 kids running around and you have to deal with all of them.
Social relationships have a lot to do with whether somebody develops major depression. It's a contributing factor. Depression can be a reaction to the end of relationships. If you break up with somebody you thought you were going to be with forever, you might dip into a major depressive episode. Depression can also be a reaction to people that have difficulty forming secure attachments. So those people that have the attachment styles in adulthood that are insecure and their obstacles to forming good, healthy, romantic relationships and friendships, they can actually make it difficult to achieve those kind of healthy relationships, and then the outcome can be depression. But it's unclear whether the end of close relationships, that's the cause of depression. In many cases, it could be the other way around, the causal link, because a person might find it difficult to keep others around them if they're constantly negative and feeling sad all the time, and they don't have any energy to do anything. So is the depression causing problems in maintaining good, healthy relationships, or is problems maintaining good, healthy relationships causing the person to be depressed? Sort of a negative downward spiral there. So this is just kind of a flow chart of what might be a consequence of having poor social skills and why that might have some effect on a person's vulnerability to depression. So a person is not really good socially, they don't make friends very well, and people don't find them very pleasant to be around. Then a person might get fewer reinforcers for social behavior. They won't make good friendships, then they won't be able to get a decent job. They might, because they're kind of rude and irritable, they might actually just encounter mainly rejection when they try to form relationships with other people. And if they do encounter people to hang out with and spend time with, they might naturally gravitate to people who confirm their more or less negative self-views, since they have these poor social skills that they're grumpy and hard to get along with. And then all of these 3 factors will ultimately increase a person's vulnerability to becoming depressed.
Well, another factor that contributes to whether or not someone becomes depressed is their thinking habits or their cognitive habits. So, if you explain events as uncontrollable and permanent, well, this can lead to a sense of hopelessness, and this will make you vulnerable to depression. If you think your life is going horribly and it's always going to be that way, and there's nothing you can do to change it, it's not surprising you might feel hopeless. You're protected from depression, though, if you explain events as controllable and changeable. So, yes, right now everything is going wrong, but I can change it. I'm going to do something and change my life, and I'm going to take control. So, think about that external versus internal locus of control. Those who have the external locus of control, that everything is beyond their control, it's luck, fate, they're going to be more vulnerable to depression. Whereas if you feel like you have control, then you're going to be able to, when bad events happen in your life, recognize that yes, bad events happen, but it's not permanent. My life is going to get better. Another factor is people who ruminate on their negative events. So imagine you have a pretty good life, but one bad thing happened. Imagine you're a football player and you missed the winning pass to win a game. I hope that makes sense for all you football fans, but you didn't get the throw, so you lost the game for your team. If you always think about these negative events, like the time you blew it for your team, then this can lead you to depression as well, because you're not taking in any of the other events in your life or aspects of your life that are positive and that make your life fun. Instead, you're just focusing on the negative. So this is a problem as well and should be avoided.
So this graph just shows you that strength of that association between thinking style and your likelihood of developing major depression. The blue bars are high-risk people that have that thinking style that tends them towards negative interpretations of events, really emphasizing negative events over positive ones, ruminating a lot on negative things that happen to them. So those people are at high risk. These are the actual numbers of them developing major depression and minor depression over the next 2.5 years. As a result of measuring their thinking style 2.5 years earlier. So you guys can see that people that have this thinking style are way more likely to develop depression, both major and minor, if they have that thinking style than if they don't, these little green bars here. Okay, and this is for people with no prior history of depression at all, whereas this represents the same pattern, but in participants that do have a prior history of depression. So whether you've had a major depressive episode or not in your past, if you're one of these negative thinkers, then you're much more likely to develop major depression in the not too distant future. And that's only 2.5 years. So imagine if they went ahead 20 years to see the likelihood. This is the percentage, 50% in this case, 40% only in this case. So it's a major factor. Okay, so then when you talk about major depression, we sort of cast it as there's this genetic component, and then there's the life experience and environmental influences, your social relationships, the life events that have happened to you. We've treated them as one or the other can cause depression, but the truth is that in reality, they often combine forces to produce major depressive episodes in people. And this way of explaining the cause of depression is known as the vulnerability, and that another word for this is diathesis, stress model. So what this recognizes is that multiple influences contribute to the onset of an episode of major depression. You can have pre-existing factors, genetics, just your biology, your personality, your habits of thinking, that can predispose you to become depressed if you have these traits in reaction to stressful experiences that occur during your life. So you might have a predisposition, and then something in your life might then trigger this major depressive episode in somebody that's vulnerable.